make this Greatest Living Person award.
In November 2002, at the People of the Year Awards, a special award was presented to K Whitaker as the greatest living Irishman.
The thought occurred to me that, you know, if you live long enough, you'll either be canonised or be found out. Worse still, you can be canonised and found out afterwards. And I hope I escaped that fate at any moment.
TK Ken Whitaker, something of a paradox. Greatest living Irishman, yet to many largely unknown. But then historical greatness depends not on fame, but on impact.
But for the man on the street, it's a problem of how does it affect him, and his future progress, his family's progress.
And Whitaker had impact. He was arguably the most accomplished civil servant in Ireland in the 20th century. Secretary of the Department of Finance at 40, he introduced modern Keynesian economics to Ireland, was a key negotiator of Ireland's accession to the European Union.
I, as Governor of the Central Bank, have been emphasising that other part.
Influential with Sean Lemass and Jack Lynch on Northern Ireland policy, his analysis and prescription, written 30 years before, anticipates the Good Friday Agreement of 1998.
Of having a depressing influence on our economy at present.
I left at 60, and in fact a new life opened up.
And in retirement, Ken Whitaker was indefatigable in his contribution to public life, involved in constitutional review, prison reform, the Irish language, and one-time Chancellor of the National University of Ireland.
Jack Lynch to become a senator.
I don't think there was any other official, remotely comparable impact upon Irish history in the second half of the 20th century. I mean, politicians, De Valera, Fitzgerald, the church, I suppose, McQuaid, but for the rest, the man who really changed things was Ken Whitaker.
He was one of these people, and they're rare enough really, who made a dramatic difference. Partly, I think, by what he achieved through economic development, partly by being himself. One of the things that struck me when I became secretary was that I had a model of Whitaker in my mind, and I thought, when I was faced with difficult decisions, particularly big matters about the national interest and so on, relations with ministers, I tended to ask myself, what would Whitaker do in these circumstances?
A sense of duty, I suppose, a sense of patriotism, a sense of, perhaps like the parable of the talents, that he's a man with talents and gifts, and that he's going to use them.
If you take the government to mean the whole corporate finance department, the External Ireland, and you know, I felt he had an enormous influence in it.
He was a man of the highest intellectual and moral quality, a man of great integrity. And I find it fascinating that he was adjudged to be recently the greatest living Irishman.
First of all, we were probably the first generation to inherit, as it were, an independent state. We didn't have to take any part in founding it. We weren't out with our rifles and so on. I'm a 1916 man only because I was born in 1916.
Ken Whitaker was born in Rostrevor, County Down. His father worked in the local small linen mill, but found that in the years after World War I, the future of the Rostrevor mill was not too secure. When Ken was 6 years of age, the family moved to Drogheda. It was 1922, and his father took up a new position in the thriving Greenmount and Boyne linen mill, one of the larger industries in the town. Ken Whitaker was always appreciative of the education he got at St. Joseph's in King Street from the Christian Brothers.
Happy memories, wonderful teachers in secondary school. I owe an enormous debt to them, and a late teacher, Father McCann, who taught history and Irish, and came in half an hour before school time for no reward whatever to teach a handful of us French. And French wasn't on the curriculum, and that has enriched my life immensely.
He was a distinguished pupil. In the 1932 Intercert exam, he won 4th place in Ireland and won himself a cash scholarship.
I remember being very gratified to be able to buy my first bicycle. To buy a bicycle in Drogheda is really an absolute necessity. You couldn't choose a better place in Ireland to be young and venturesome because it's a medieval town and it has the whole Boyne Valley just in its background.
As a schoolboy, he was active in the town's social and community life. An early introduction to the lower slopes of finance and accounting came through his involvement with the Penny Bank Savings Scheme, run by the Augustinians in Drogheda.
But that was excruciating torment, because after getting in all the money on the Friday night, you had to balance the books. If there was a penny or twopence out, we had to go back through everything. And I would say, look, for God's sake, I'll give you the penny. Oh no, that's not, the books must be right.
In the Leaving Certificate of 1934, Ken Whitaker again distinguished himself. He thought he might study medicine at UCD. Meanwhile, he had also sat the entrance exam for the civil service.
And then my father was just about to retire, and it suddenly came to dawn on us all that what were the prospects of being able to finance a 6-year university course when he had only a small pension. At that same moment, the postman dropped a letter in my letterbox saying that I had got first place in the clerical officer's examination, so very quickly it was decided that the bird in the hand ought to be taken.
So in 1934 he became a civil servant as a clerical officer in the Department of Education.
So for the extra few shillings a week I travelled second class, which gave me a chance of reading and studying on the way up and back. But one thing it taught me, which I am imbued with to this day, punctuality. If you missed the 8:20 train from Drogheda to Dublin, you were late about an hour, and a big red cross was put against your name on the roll book, and maybe your increment was stopped. In the mid-30s, there were the first publications of penguins and pelicans, and these books contained a good deal of economics and especially a good deal of socialism. So I became a rabid, well, not quite rabid, socialist. And when I first got a vote, voted for the Labour Party in the mistaken belief that they were a socialist party.
The year after he joined the civil service, Ken Whitaker took the exam for executive officer. He got first place. His early ambition is manifest in his rise through the civil service. 1937, first place in exam for assistant inspector of taxes. 1938, first place in exam for administrative officer. And that same year, he joined the elite, Department of Finance.
In fact, it was a great release to get to finance from other departments. You felt you were entering somewhere where everyone was an officer, everyone carried a marshal's baton in his briefcase.
And the youngest AO, administrative officer, could talk to the general, the secretary of the department.
McGilligan, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Not that you would do it very often, because he was treated with considerable awe and respect. But I eventually was able to push past that barrier and establish very good personal relations with him by just being a bit bold.
J.J. McGilligan was of the old school, and his cast of mind was that of an accountant, not an economist. He was at his most content when he was turning down proposals from the spending departments. Balanced budgets with minimal public expenditure was his ideal. Such thinking was the hallmark of the Department of Finance.
Whitaker's relationship with McGilligan was interesting. McGilligan was his patron. Whitaker was recognised at a very early point as being exceptionally able, having an exceptionally incisive mind. And McGilligan was important, obviously, in ensuring that Whitaker got promotions sort of early on out of term.
The department had steered the Irish economy through the difficult early years after independence, through the Civil War, the International Depression, a trade war with Britain, and had then settled for frugal comfort during World War II, known in Ireland as the Emergency.
In the course of his speech, Mr. De Valera said it was vital for everybody to put themselves in a position to face whatever troubles might confront them.
There had been a widespread naive belief that once independence was achieved, prosperity would follow. Whitaker, now a student of economics, appreciated that the dynamics of a 20th century economy were more complex.
Whitaker first came to prominence when McGilligan made him sort of personal advisor to Frank Aiken as Minister for Finance in 1945. Aiken came in with his own very unusual and idiosyncratic ideas on policy, financial policy, social credit policies, but these were anathema to the department. And McGilligan asked Whitaker to keep in contact with the minister almost on a daily basis.
Oh, yes, Minister, that's a very interesting idea. And then you would be sitting there, and then you'd say, but I wonder what would we do if such and such and such and such. And then, and also such and such and such and such. And then he would say, oh, well, I'll think about it further.
They became quite close. And of course, this gave Whitaker access to a minister, which for an assistant principal at the age of 28 was pretty well unprecedented.
The Statistical and Social Inquiry Society of Ireland has been meeting since 1847, since the founding. Since then, every major shift in Irish history has been debated by its members, by economists, public servants, and the intelligentsia. New theories have been debated, heresies mooted, and in the 1940s and 1950s, Ken Whitaker was among the heretics. Whitaker's main heresy was that he was impressed by the new economic guru, John Maynard Keynes, who was to prove to be the most influential economist of the century. McGilligan detested Keynes, once stating that he belonged to the escapist school of economists. Keynes argued that unemployment could best be tackled through government intervention in the economy, if necessary, by public works. There were now two schools of thought in finance, the old guard, who believed the government should stay out of the economy, and the young Keynesians, who believed in state intervention.
In the heart of one of the world's richest pasture lands.
The Irish economy in the post-war period remained stagnant, too dependent on agriculture and on the British market, and with any inefficiencies in native industries unexposed, sheltered by tariff barriers. The old policy of national self-sufficiency was not delivering jobs. While post-war European countries were achieving growth rates of 4%, Ireland was barely managing 1%, and the outlook remained poor. The problems were clear to Ken Whitaker, and becoming clearer as he studied for a master's degree in economics at London University by correspondence.
I have a distinct recollection of pushing a pram containing a wailing baby, first child, up and down with one hand while I was trying to write an essay in the correspondence course with the other.
Yet few of them there are on the outside who would care to trade places with Ireland's farmers.
Over the period of the 50s, 250,000 people emigrated. That had an extraordinarily depressing effect then. There was a feeling that, and the phrase at the time was, and I remember contemporaries of mine saying it, this country is finished. Get out and emigrate somewhere.
The 1950s was a time of pessimism. The census revealed that the population had dipped below 3 million, and if the downward trend continued, some predicted that Ireland's population would be less than 2 million by the end of the 20th century.
There tends to be a collapse of confidence, even among the political elites, among the politicians, civil servants, the hierarchy. People are beginning seriously to question, well, what was the point of independence? And there is a sort of thrashing around, no real defined sense of direction. And I think that's what Ken Whitaker does. That is why I think he's so important, that he provides, if you like, a roadmap.
This trying to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps was not going to get anywhere, obviously, in a country that was poor and had a very small market. And the only way you could promote employment and living standards was by gearing yourself to sell your produce abroad. And since agricultural produce could only be sold in the British market at low prices dictated by their food policy, you had to try and get into other things, industry and services.
This, as you see, is the banned minutes of the Statistical and Social Irish Society, 1949 to 1973.
On May the 27th, 1956, Whitaker presented a paper to the Statistical and Social Inquiry Society of Ireland.
The paper was called Capital Formation, Saving and Economic Progress.
He hinted in this paper that there should be scope for some leadership role for the public servant. 3 days later, in a surprise promotion, bypassing more senior colleagues, Whitaker was made Secretary of the Department of Finance.
Yes, I do remember it very distinctly because I was in with the Minister for Finance at that time, Gerald Sweetman, and he said to me, what way would it be taken in the Department of Finance if Whitaker were Secretary? And I said, well, there's two schools of thought. The younger people will probably be very interested in, inflame their ambitions. The older people will have a great deal of sympathy for Sarsfield Hogan. But he did promote Whitaker, and it was very, very newsworthy in the Department of Finance and outside.
I can remember the mood very well because I have in fact a diary entry for that day. It was May the 29th, this is 1956, Tuesday. About 4:30, news leaked around. The unbelievable had happened. Mr. Whitaker had been appointed. Great excitement and a very popular choice. It's like the beginning of a new reign. We all wonder what it will mean. We feel it will bring changes. Home, feeling very excited about the news.
People looked with interest to what he was going to do, and he didn't lose any time about satisfying their curiosity. The department became a bit of a buzz pot.
You felt that having got there, having been amongst the first generation of well-educated young Irish men in the civil service, and having got to the top so quickly, that you owed something to the country. You know, there was a very strong feeling of a sense of public service.
I think when he became secretary, he was very much a man of destiny, really, I think. And I think he's somebody who has had this sense himself, and I think he wanted to fulfill that.
Whitaker broadened the horizons of the department. He chaired an interdepartmental committee looking into possible membership of the international trade organizations and the World Bank. As part of the process, a World Bank delegation came to Dublin to assess Ireland's readiness to involve itself in international trade. They paid a courtesy call on the then Taoiseach, Eamon de Valera.
He gave them a version of his ideal for the country, very like that famous St. Patrick's Day speech, you know.
The economic aim is to make the country as self-sufficing as is reasonably possible.
And the International Monetary Fund head of mission said to me in the corridor outside, "Strange man, your Prime Minister," you see. And they couldn't understand that sort of, primitive philosophy.
It was 1957. Whitaker took an initiative.
The thing that I think personally triggered Ken Whitaker's action in this case was a cartoon on the front of Dublin Opinion, in which there was a woman consulting a fortune teller who was looking into a crystal ball. And the question was, has Ireland a future? And Ken, being the man he is, he actually used this as the first paragraph of a memorandum which he sent to the Minister for Finance, Jim Ryan, and was circulated to other ministers.
We were all so despondent that unless we did something like that, we would almost gone out of business.
This was the genesis of what would prove to be one of the most significant publications in 20th century Ireland. In a memo, he called for brainstorming from a group of younger civil servants.
My mental picture is a fool's cap page of single-space writing, which he told the assistant secretaries that he wanted to set up a small committee in the department, and I was nominated to be given this task.
7 civil servants worked on the project. Whitaker would read and review and circulate drafts, asking for observations. Good ideas were included quickly, without any fuss. That was Whitaker's style.
I remember one of my colleagues came up with the idea of encouraging fish farms, which I think is part of the programme, and so on with the different aspects. Everybody had a look at whatever they were doing, and the idea was to be positive, to think creatively.
I hesitate to use corny word like honoured or whatever, but we felt chuffed, is the best word to put it. We usually met after the office had closed for the day. Very few finance men went home at 5 o'clock in those days. It was the spirit of the department.
I knew that I had colleagues who would be extremely interested and willing to help. I didn't fear the job. In fact, I relished having the chance to do something to save the country from going down the drain.
The introduction to the report, outlining the overall approach, was written by Whitaker himself. It was revolutionary and heresy to the old school. Whatever the merits of self-sufficiency as a national policy for former times, wrote Whitaker, it was no longer suited to the Ireland of the late 1950s. Protection would have to go, and the challenge of free trade accepted. In another break with precedent, Economic Development was published under Ken Whitaker's name. It wasn't a white paper, it wasn't a green paper. It became known as the grey paper.
You had, in some sense, an objective, non-political document. It was emanating from the civil service, and I think it helped the old Fianna Fáil to be transformed economically into the newer Fianna Fáil.
They could say we're taking the advice of unbiased civil servants, and they got away with it. There wasn't a debate on this change of policy.
The government prepared a bill in parallel with economic development, the 1958 to 1963 Programme for Economic Expansion. It was always referred to as a programme, never as a plan.
You must remember that it was only in the early 1950s that planning in democracies became acceptable. Before that, it had been associated with rigid communist regulation of economies.
They did keep saying it wasn't a plan at the time, whether that was to counter any thoughts on that line. But they never pretended it was a plan. You know, this is the road we must follow type of thing, you know.
The policies of the 30s, the Fianna Fáil policies of the 30s, self-sufficiency, protectionism, in effect they are torn up, which was a courageous thing for Lemass to do personally, because as Minister for Industry and Commerce at the time, he'd been most closely associated with those policies. But he was intellectually persuaded, largely by Whitaker, that those policies had failed dismally.
It was, I think, John Fitzgerald Kennedy who said that the role of the expert was to examine a problem to a conclusion.
Nobody could as effectively got rid of protection as the very architect of it himself, Lemass.
The function of the minister, the function of the government, is to take the decision.
He often said that not to make a decision was the worst decision of all.
RTE2.
The year after the first programme for economic expansion had been launched, Eamon de Valera retired to the presidency, and Sean Lemass became Taoiseach.
Jeff said to me when he was leaving that a breath of fresh air will go through the country now with Sean Lemass. He wanted industry in the country, he wanted jobs for people.
And the economy soon changed gear. Foreign investors were offered tax breaks to encourage industrial jobs in Ireland. Export of manufactured goods was actively supported. Economic growth had been stagnant at 1%, the target set was 2%, the achievement 4%.
It was almost like an economic and psychological Viagra in the economy.
The biggest factor of production working for us was the psychological factor. Of course, as you make progress, people expect then to keep on the higher rate of growth.
Progress in modern Ireland is seen most clearly in
The 1960s was a decade of change, the coming of television, Vatican II, and the programme for economic expansion brought a new prosperity to the country. There was something of a generational change in politics and the civil service, and among the youngest was Ken Whitaker, as Secretary of Finance, the leader of the civil service. He won the respect of all political parties and of the interest groups we now call the social partners.
Ken Whitaker addressed two major trade union conferences in 1962 and in 1963. I was industrial officer of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions at that time. And in both of those speeches, the first time now that a Secretary of the Department of Finance was really coming out from the closet of the department itself and talking to trade union people, he spoke about the necessity for a national incomes policy.
Now, he dealt with rather difficult economic issues and in what I would call Department of Finance speak, but he won their confidence, and he offered effectively, on behalf of the financial establishment of the state, the opportunity to trade unions, employers, and he representing the government in effect, to become involved in the embryonic tripartite discussions on wage levels and on social policy.
Ken Whitaker was an intimidating person to work with in some ways. He was so good, so much on top of the job. But having said that, provided you knew your work, he was very appreciative of it. Now, if he didn't know your work, perhaps he could be a little impatient because he was a man in a hurry, he wanted to get things done. There was a feeling, I thought at the time, that his dominance tended to overshadow other senior people in the department.
Once we turned our minds towards free trade, we were anxious to get into some organisation, particularly one which would have agricultural support. The Six would have been the ideal place to be.
Ken Whitaker's prominence and expertise made him Lemass's ideal choice to lead the negotiations in Ireland's attempt to join the EEC in the early 1960s. Lemass did not look to the Department of Foreign Affairs. Joining the EEC was to be a cornerstone of Lemass's policy to increase economic growth. The advantage of being inside the free trade zone of the then 6 members was clear. But with the Republic's economy still closely tied to Britain, it was obvious that the fate of the Irish application depended on whether Britain was successful.
The meeting of the Common Market Commission in Brussels is in the nature of a wait. 5 of the member nations welcome British participation, but France and de Gaulle turned thumbs down.
Ireland declined what was proffered, associate membership. Lemass was privately disappointed, even angry.
Then he decided that he should negotiate himself for ERA's membership of the Common Market. And he seemed to me to be quite determined to take any action which was necessary.
Whitaker was sent on a tour of European capitals with different ministers, again canvassing support for EEC membership. Ending protectionism, opening Ireland up to free trade, was dogma to Lemass.
He began to consider whether there was any way in which the trade between ERA and Britain could be increased without our being inside the common market.
If the Republic's economy was to seek a more balanced relationship with Britain, then it seemed logical to both Lemass and Whitaker that greater trade across the Irish border, trade with Northern Ireland, should be encouraged. Despite some cross-border cooperation on practical issues, politically there had been a North-South Cold War since partition had first been enacted.